there was the fear that anti-Semitism could spread from individual racists and infect broad segments of academia and political unit. It was never, in my view, realistic. I was one of the minority. And guess who was right? Third consideration was, of course, the history and tradition of the American Jewish involvement in the struggle for civil rights. And I'll make that connection in a couple of minutes. Now, the fact is that we know very little about the nature and extent of anti-Semitism among blacks. There's never been a comprehensive study of black attitudes toward Jews, which is an issue complicated by black attitudes toward whites in general. It's very difficult to separate out how blacks think about Jews and how blacks think about whites in general, especially since in the olden days, in the 1950s, 60s, the white person with whom the black came into contact most often was a Jew. In other words, the landlord or the shopkeeper or the teacher at the public school, they were all Jews. And it was hard to sort this out. It still is. But there are some data, and some very good data. And I'll make two observations. First of all, conventional wisdom about black anti-Semitism is unfounded. And let me take a step back. There's, if we look at attitudinal anti-Semitism in the United States, we find that as a general proposition, with some blips on the radar screen, I was a math major, so I'm never interested in what happens at a given point in time. I'm always interested in rates of change. That's what it's all about. So the levels of attitudinal anti-Semitism have dropped remarkably, radically over the past 50 years, and continues to go down. Now, how do we explain this very dramatic change in attitudes? What does attitudinal anti-Semitism mean? Push it. What do non-Jews think about Jews? That's the question. And they ask a whole bunch of different questions, and a lot of us have had discussion about the questions. They're not good anymore, and so on. But as a general proposition, the plotted on the graph looks like that. So does this mean that individual anti-Semites are being converted to philo-Semites? Does this mean that there's some kind of change in individuals? It does not. It means that what's happening is purely generational, that the newer generation of non-Jews at any level contains fewer anti-Semites than did the previous generation. Let me say that in English. Your father was an anti-Semite. You are not. Push it. Something happened in the society to make that change. Her father wasn't converted. We didn't take him into the psychoanalyst and shrink him and then, all of a sudden I love Jews. No. It's that something happened in the society so that the next generation was less anti-Semitic. And this is true over a long period of time. What happened is that, again, generally speaking, as education levels and income levels go up, social and economic conditions, the level of anti-Semitism goes down. An inverse correlation. Education up, or income up, anti-Semitism down. And this is true over all segments of society, all groups in society. Now, somehow, let's get back to blacks. Somehow there arose the idea that as education levels go up, anti-Semitism goes up in the black community. And this became conventional wisdom. It still is. Everybody believes it. And the reality is that there are no data at all to justify the assertion that in the black community, as education goes up, so does anti-Semitism. In fact, I was the first one to write about this issue, and I was excoriated. It's not true, you're making it up. The fact is there are no data to justify that assertion. And no, it's understood. What can be said, based on what the little that we do know with certitude, is that the level of anti-Semitism drops steeply for both whites and blacks as education levels go up and as income levels go up, but less so for blacks. In other words, to put it in sociological terms, the reverse correlation exists, but it's weaker. The reverse correlation is somewhat weaker. And indeed, recent surveys, the ADL surveys in the 1990s and 2000s, the Martilla surveys, on which I have serious questions, but nonetheless the data are very valuable. The data are valuable when I agree with them. So in one of the most important findings have confirmed this fact. Blacks do continue to be relatively more anti-Semitic than whites, at any given education level, but that's very different from saying that they become more anti-Semitic as they become better educated and achieve higher economic status. As do other members of society, they become less anti-Semitic. And this is very important for us to keep in mind, because it suggests something about anti-Semitism in general. How do we fight anti-Semitism? Not by chasing after anti-Semites and not by prejudice reduction programs. You improve the conditions of society and you will lessen prejudice. That's the pashtus of the Indian. And that's basically it. Now, how am I doing on time? Good. I can talk endlessly.
Okay.
And I often do. Okay. Whatever the data do or fail to reveal, the reality exists that blacks, here's the obverse side of the coin, whatever the reason, may not be constrained in their venting of anti-Semitic sentiment. In America, the principle is, I may think it, but I can't do anything about it. I can't say it. As far as I'm concerned, be gesund. You hate Jews. It's okay with me as long as you don't express it. You don't deny me a job or whatever it is. You're entitled to believe whatever you want to believe. I don't lose sleep over it. But blacks are less restrained in their expressions. The fact is that blacks always lag well behind the general population in economic and social indicators, is the only group in which the reservoir, the level of anti-Jewish feeling has not dropped, and in which taboos against expression of anti-Semitism have eroded. And additionally, and here's the second observation, I want to offer a brief analysis, they are less reluctant to repudiate the anti-Semitism in their midst. A black leader says something anti-Semitic, and we would expect, as we do in the rest of the community, that another black leader will repudiate it. This does not happen. And for many Jews, this pattern is the tough reality of anti-Semitism, of black anti-Semitism. Now let me offer an analysis. The question, is the failure to repudiate anti-Semitic statements itself anti-Semitism? Or is it a reflection of other dynamics that are at work among blacks? And we have many examples of this. Farrakhan says something, and the other leaders don't. Jesse Jackson said things, and the black ministers were reluctant to repudiate him. There are many examples over the past 20 years. And this pattern reflects the interpretation of each group, blacks and Jews, of its priorities in terms or in light of its separate past, its history. Blacks focus on unity and solidarity, which they indeed learned, at least in part from the Jewish community. They argue, legitimately, that it was black disunity that simplified slavery and helped prevent black advancement in the century following emancipation. Unity and solidarity. Jews, American Jews, focus on, indeed we are obsessed with, again legitimately, denunciation and repudiation. Jews would argue, rightly so, that the repudiation of anti-Semitism and of its practitioners by non-Jews, the willingness of those in leadership positions to speak out, is a key component in the counteraction of anti-Semitism. Jews argue, Marshall, that it was the failure to denounce Hitler's early evils that opened the way for the Holocaust. And we're not wrong. Now, it's important, if we understand this analysis, and if we accept it, as I do, it's important for Jews to understand that often when black anti-Semitism is invoked, he's not repudiating, he's an anti-Semite. When it's invoked, often what is being described may not be the attitude of the black population in general toward Jews. We don't know very much about that, but very different dynamics indeed. Those of repudiation and solidarity, each one reflecting its priority, each group reflecting its priorities in light of its own history. Are you with me? Good. And this may be even more significant, again I go back to the question of the tactics and strategies of our communal organizations. Yes, denunciation and repudiation of anti-Semitism are key elements in the counteraction of anti-Semitism. And look, We shouldn't let black leaders off the hook. Courageous black leaders have in fact repudiated anti-Semitism, and indeed continue to do so. Martin Luther King is the classic example of this. But Jews ought not recklessly scapegoat the broader black population when hard data on the population are not at hand. And the worst possible thing you could do is to accuse someone of being an anti-Semite when that person may not be one, and it's counterproductive. That's the worst kind of tactic. Anyway, let me put that one aside. I spent a couple of minutes on an important case study. That was the events of Crown Heights. We all know Crown Heights in August 1991, an event that continues even today as a flashpoint between blacks and Jews in New York. And there's no question that a serious anti-Semitic outburst occurred in August of 1991. An anti-Semitic murder was committed. But in analyzing the conditions in Crown Heights that led to the tragic event, you have to be a little bit nuanced. The key question with respect to Crown Heights is whether Crown Heights was sui generis. Ought we extrapolate Crown Heights to the black population or other communities around the country? Pashut, could Crown Heights happen elsewhere? That's basically the question. That's the important question. It was an awful thing that happened in New York, but this communal leaders needed to think in those terms. Very few, unfortunately, did. Now, how do I analyze Crown Heights? When I say I, it's a group of us had some study groups around this. Jonathan Ryder, my colleague at Barnard, who wrote about this as well. And our view is that the events in Crown Heights had more to do with long-standing, as the anthropologists teach us to say, tribal rivalries. Rivalries of real estate, of power, access to power, culture, than they did with a deep anti-Semitism that may not be present in a hardly monolithic black population in that neighborhood. It's important to remember that the blacks, who were the blacks in Crown Heights? Mostly Caribbeans. They had no issue with Jews. Jews weren't an issue for them. So some blacks who came in from the outside, who agitated the pot, who stirred the pot, the great Gödel, Al Sharpton, people like that, but the blacks in Crown Heights, for the most part, it wasn't an issue. The leadership of the issues were not Jews, but access to power. You had two growing populations in a relatively small geographical area. The Jews, mainly the Chabad, the Hasidei Lubavitch, and the blacks. And there were rivalries for the most part over real estate and by extension over access to power. The conditions that caused Crown Heights were absolutely unique to Crown Heights and had very little to do with anti-Semitism. Let me say that sentence again. They had nothing to do with anti-Semitism, the conditions that caused Crown Heights. Now, further is the question of, in general, whether the anti-Semitism of the black street kid yelling, "Kill the Jew," is the same as the anti-Semitism of Louis Farrakhan, or is it the same as the white skinhead from Jersey City, or of the Holocaust deniers? We're not going to know very much about what goes on in neighborhoods like Crown Heights, where "Kill the Jew" is directed at the most visible manifestation of white power, as I suggested earlier, until we are ready to mount a serious ethnographic study of the street. And as I said, it seems clear that the causes and events of Crown Heights would not be replicated elsewhere. That's the key issue. Let me give you an example here. An example by contrast. Consider another neighborhood, the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn. Williamsburg is a couple of neighborhoods over, also Chassidim of Satmar in this case. Now Williamsburg has it's very similar to Crown Heights demographically and socially, sociologically. Same ingredients as Crown Heights. Tribal rivalries over land and power. A very well organized and politically savvy Hasidic group, the Satmara. A minority group that feels that has been left out. And it's a tinderbox that could explode. Same situation in Crown Heights, only in Williamsburg, there are no blacks, it's Hispanics. So it wasn't black anti-Semitism that caused Crown Heights, it was a tribal rivalry, mainly over land, exacerbated by individuals Rabbi Sharpton, who exploited this tense situation. Now, a small coda to Crown Heights is very interesting, and it goes back to something I said much earlier at the beginning of the thing about intergroup relations. You know, a couple of months after Crown Heights happened, there was an incident. Remember, Crown Heights was triggered by the fact that a little black child was struck by a part of the motorcade of the Rebbe, and there were questions about how we killed, right? Struck and killed, right? And you know, so a couple of months afterwards, it happened that a black baby, so a very small child, was in fact struck in the streets of Crown Heights by a car. And if I remember the facts correctly, a Hatzolah came, and this was a very big thing. It made all the television stations, the news, and it went a long way to, and it's part of the healing process between blacks and Jews at the time. So of course, that very day, I saw this on television, the 6 o'clock news. Chassid was interviewed, you know, put a microphone in the guy's face, and he said, well, in response to a question, well, you know, we Jews, when it comes to saving the lives of non-Jews, we Jews make absolutely no distinction between Jews and Lahavdil non-Jews. Need we say more? Now, of course, this guy was reflecting a particular halacha reality, whatever you want to discuss in terms of the halacha and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, okay. Now, finally, what led to the rupture in black-Jewish relations? You know, and in fact, did the rupture? You know, we all talk about the broken alliance is the term of art. Now, conventional wisdom has it that black anti-Semitism caused the alliance to fray and to break. So the real story is a little bit more complicated. We need to go back to the civil rights movement itself. With the growing success of the civil rights movement, the character of the relationship changed. The coalition expanded, other groups came in, the struggle became a movement, as I said. Now, as issues became more complex, we saw disillusionment and frustration on the part of many blacks that their daily lives did not change as their hopes and aspirations were stirred by the revolutionary victories in the courts, Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and furthermore, with the emergence of the Black Power cry, black leaders rejected their erstwhile allies, leading to a new perception among Jews that the ally was the enemy. So clearly that was a factor. But that's from the Jewish perspective. But what few people want to recall is from the black perspective. As our agenda changed, and remember, here's the important thing, we need to go back to the timeline. In the mid-1960s, two things happened that radically changed the Jewish agenda for 25 years. It was the Six-Day War, and let me tell you that for American Jews, institutionally, Israel was not on the agenda before 1967. Maybe a little bit the arms sales in the 50s and including Sinai and so on and so forth, but as a general proposition, it wasn't. And indeed, as strange as it may sound, non-Zionism and to be sure, anti-Zionism and clearly non-Zionism were legitimate positions in American Jewish life. It's clearly in the 50s and even until the 1960s. So the Jewish agenda changed. It became more parochial, more particularistic, more Jewish, Soviet Jewry, Israel, and so on and so forth. And the blacks asked, legitimately from their perspective, Yidden, where are you? You have abandoned us. And indeed, to some degree we did. We abandoned the total agenda. We focused in on Israel and Soviet Jewry, and that's where the resources went and the money went. And of course, not to go into, not to be marked on this because it's a subject for a whole other lecture, were the beginnings of tensions over the other end of the civil rights issue, and that's affirmative action, which I can address in the discussion, but I don't want to talk about it. But it's of a piece of the fact that we were no longer, from their perspective, we were no longer there for them. and we were paying attention to what was important to us. Again, what was considered Jewish security and Jewish issues. Also, there's another small but important point, that is that even in the communities where the relationship continues to be strong, it's still at tensions. The black social policy agenda tends to be, generally speaking, much more conservative than the Jewish social policy agenda. When I say social policy, I mean issues like reproductive choice, like the separation of church and state, all of those First Amendment issues, where the Jewish community continues to be, you should excuse the expression, very liberal community. The black community is very, very conservative. So there are clearly tensions around those, but that's mostly in the communities. Now, the question for Jews, and this will be my closing observation, thank God, is a larger one, and in the mid-90s, and again I go back to the timeline of American Jewish issues. In the mid-1990s and clearly into the 2000s, with the diminution of what I call the security agenda, physical security, anti-Semitism, just not there. I mean, yeah, there's anti-Semitism, Baruch Hashem, Farrakhan is still there, but the ability of Jews to participate in the workings of society, which is my criterion for the security of Jews, has nothing to do with whatever anti-Semitism is out there. It has to do with Jews' place in the society, which has happened to be very good. If there are 10 Jews in the United States who have any difficulty in participating in the day-to-day life of the society because of fear of anti-Semitism, I would be surprised. In fact, there is no Jews who have that fear. That's a reality of American Jews. So the diminution of this, what I call physical security agenda, the peace process, whatever its pitfalls, it's a different issue. The end of the Soviet Jewry movement as a political issue. It's a resettlement issue. Now it's a social services, and so on. The agenda turns further inward. So the exogenous issues, the external issues, the exogenous agenda has moved more toward an endogenous, an internal agenda of Jewish identity and continuity, and in many ways, this more focused Jewish agenda speaks to critical Jewish needs. Only a foolish community would ignore its survival issues, teamwork and so on and so forth. The question is, however, whether in pursuit of a progressively narrower agenda, it is necessary or wise to jettison vigorous Jewish social action or vigorous Jewish action on broad social issues, as is advocated by some significant voices in the leadership of our community. And I think that we need to look closely to the effects of our own behavior on intergroup relations. Our issues in America are not restricted to the counting up of Jews who have Christmas trees in their homes. It's part of the Jewish history and ethos, and whatever fancy word you want to use, that no group can escape responsibility for combating all forms of hatred and for making common cause toward building a more productive society. If we ignore this, then we will meet in the same room in